Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
The City Club has featured Adrian Benepi, who was the New York City Parks Commissioner during the construction of the High Line, and Brian Payne, the founder of the Indianapolis Cultural Trail. Today, we're going to talk about a city that is taking a different approach. Rather than investing in one project, Philadelphia is investing in neighborhoods. In 2016, Philadelphia Mayor Jim Kenney announced the Rebuilding Community Infrastructure, or ReBuild initiative, a $500 investment in the renovation of parks, playgrounds, recreation centers, and libraries throughout the city. Designed to promote increased equity, expanded community engagement, and new economic opportunities, ReBuild represents one of the largest community infrastructure investments in the city's history. The William Penn Foundation, inspired by the mayor's vision, has committed $100 million, the largest gift in the foundation's history, towards this effort. So, we are pleased to have Shawn D. McCaney, the foundation's executive director, with us today to discuss the context and background for the creation of the ReBuild initiative and the motivation behind the foundation's unprecedented investment. Mr. McCaney joined the foundation in 2003 and has held several roles within the organization before being named executive director in March 2017. In his current position, McCaney oversees the foundation's operations, investments, and its $112 million annual grant-making and evaluation budget, which is focused on increasing high-quality educational opportunities for economically disadvantaged children, protecting the Delaware River watershed, and supporting arts, culture, and the development of accessible and vibrant public space. Mr. McCaney received his graduate degree from the University of Pennsylvania, his undergraduate degree from Temple University. He's a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners and the American Society of Landscape Architects, and is a licensed professional planner in the state of New Jersey. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Mr. Shawn McCaney.
Thanks, John. I am thrilled to be here today and grateful for the invitation to speak with the City Club, or to the City Club. I want to thank John, also Nelson Beckford of the Cleveland Foundation, who suggested this program, and Stephanie Jansky of the City Club for help making today possible. First thing I want to say, I want to apologize, right? I'm from Philly. It means two things. I talk with an accent, and I talk fast. There's nothing I can do about that. But the City Club has indicated that an English translation of my presentation will be available after my meeting. But this is my first visit to Cleveland. I've long wanted to come, and I was told this will not be my only visit. But I've heard many great things about the city: Cleveland Metro Parks, the Cuyahoga River Restoration, Greater Cleveland Partnership, and the Sayest Education Initiative. The truth is, I love learning from other places, and I believe there's real value in information exchange between cities like Cleveland and Philadelphia that are tackling some of the same issues and challenges. Over recent years, and especially now in the current national political climate, I don't think many of us are looking to Washington for answers to those challenges. I don't know what the experience has been here in Cleveland, but in Philadelphia, we've witnessed a significant evaporation of federal support. For example, Philadelphia has experienced an 86% reduction in real dollars in our community development block grant funding since 1974. Now, I'm hopeful that someday we will once again see the federal government as an important partner and supporter. Increasingly, we feel like we're on our own and have to come up with our own solutions to our own problems. And Philadelphia is a city of profound challenges. A quarter of our residents, 400,000 people, live in poverty, half of them in deep poverty. And a stunning 37% of our children live in poor households. The city's unemployment rate remains stubbornly 2 points higher than the region or the nation as a whole. And while improving, our school district continues to struggle. 30% of our high school graduates do not graduate. Absent aid and policy leadership from our national government, many folks, including myself, believe it's really up to the great urban centers like Cleveland, Philadelphia, and other places to come up with the innovative policy and practice solution to our contemporary challenges. And in fact, that's the subject of a new book by Bruce Katz and Jeremy Nowak, my predecessor at the foundation. In their new book, The New Localism, the authors point to examples of cities across the country that are leading local problem solving relating to things like inclusive economic development, public and private partnerships, and innovative municipal finance. Now, it's just say, though, that while I'm all for local problem solving, I do worry a little bit about the overemphasis on the purely local. I wouldn't want us all to scurry off to our own corners and become even more isolated and encourage further social, community, and political fragmentation. But I think cities and regions that are networking and exchanging information and ideas and learning from each other can help mitigate that a bit. So in the spirit of this kind of city-to-city exchange, I want to talk a little bit about a little do-it-yourself community reinvestment that we're trying back in Philly. Rebuild Philly is Mayor Jim Kenney's plan to invest $500 million in the city's beloved but battered neighborhood parks, playgrounds, and recreation centers and libraries. But the thing I really want to make sure I get across today is that Rebuild is more than just a capital program. It's more than just deferred maintenance. It's about nudging the city toward a more strategic approach to community reinvestment and revitalizing the civic life of the city. But before diving in, I want to tell you a little bit about the William Penn Foundation, where I work. And the first thing to know is that we were not founded by William Penn, right? He didn't put 100 shillings aside in 1700. The source of our funding is much more recent. The foundation was created by the Roman Haas Chemical Company, which had the great good fortune of commercializing plexiglass on the eve of World War II. Cockpit canopies of fighter planes, nose cones of, and gun turrets of bombers, and even the lenses of periscopes on submarines were all made by plexiglass manufactured by Roman Haas. Created right after the war, the foundation initially focused on medical educational institutions, but today we're laser focused on promoting early literacy, protecting the water quality of the Delaware River watershed, and finally expanding access to arts and culture, especially among low-income communities. Since 1961, the foundation has also been a big supporter of parks and open spaces, recognizing its value to community renewal. A few years ago, we created an entirely new grant-making program to specifically support the development of public space. In fact, the foundation's investment in Rebuild is the largest grant in its history. And while our $100 million grant for Rebuild ranks among the largest recent big park grants, most of the other ones were for downtown or signature park spaces. But our grant was different. Our grant is an investment in a public parks and recreation system of the city. And today I'm going to discuss why we're inspired to make such an unprecedented investment. To set the stage for that conversation, I'm going to start by discussing the local conditions that made Rebuild possible. First, the role of investments in public space and civic amenities played in the Renaissance story of Center City, Philadelphia as a model. I'm going to talk a little bit about our own role in creating a new source of new private funding for community asset reinvestment. And finally, and most importantly, the impact of the election of Jim Kenney as mayor, bringing with him a fairly bold agenda focused on equity. Center City, Philadelphia today, our downtown, is a very different place than it was 30 years ago. Today, residents and visitors see a soaring skyline transformed by the Comcast Corporation. Thank you for your cable bills. Reinvigorated in new cultural institutions, reimagined public spaces, and an extraordinary quality of life that is very easy to take for granted. That Center City has always been this way. In fact, it's commonplace among the new generation of Philadelphians to do just that. To some, that's a sign of success. But as a ground level observer who came to the city as a young college student and witnessed the transformation of downtown firsthand, I never take it for granted. I always try to remind myself what Philadelphia was like 30 years ago, so just to remember how much things have improved, but also to remind myself that profound change is possible even when it doesn't seem possible. Because the Philadelphia I knew as a college, in my college days was the city of the move bombing. During my sophomore year of Philadelphia, the city of firsts, the first hospital, the first art museum, the first computer, was the first city in America to bomb itself. In a ham-fisted attempt to dislodge a militant Back to Nature group, the Philadelphia Police Department dropped an explosive device on the roof of the MOVE organization headquarters and burned down an entire neighborhood, killing 11 people. These horrific images of the MOVE bombing were broadcast around the world. This was the international image of Philadelphia in 1985. My junior year of college was the Great Trash Strike of 1986, in which the streets became canyons of uncollected trash. You know, it felt like the city was out of control, that things could never get better because we couldn't even figure out how to pick up the damn trash. The notorious Gary Heidnick was arrested by senior year for creating a torture chamber in his basement. Again, the city felt like a scary place. And in the late 80s, the crack epidemic scarred the city. Not only did it take a great human toll, the crime wave that accompanied it helped to reverse some early neighborhood realization efforts that were already underway. But perhaps the greatest humiliation of them all, Rocky V, right? Worst movie of 1990 or ever. Even Rocky looks bored in the movie. But the bookend event for me, though, was the One Meridian Plaza fire of 1991. It was bad enough that this was the third tallest building destroyed by fire in the world prior to 9/11. Even worse, the burned-out hulk of the building stood for 8 years in Center City. Today, this would be unthinkable. But like the move bombing, the trash strike, the crack epidemic, having a burned-out skyscraper standing in the very heart of Center City, directly across from City Hall, made you feel like nothing could get done, nothing could get fixed. Fast forward 30 years after the One Meridian Plaza fire, and Center City is utterly transformed through parallel booms in population and construction. Over 23,000 new residential units have been built in downtown, and Greater Center City has experienced a 20% growth in population. Now, the full story of the rebirth of Center City is really for another day, but today I'll say that the renaissance of downtown was a result of many actions by many people over many years. It was not an overnight success. But what is clear is that the reinvestment in the Center City's public spaces and civic assets over the preceding decades has had a major impact in improving the image and brand of the city. So much so that an unprecedented event occurred in early 2015. The New York Times actually had something nice to say about Philadelphia, right? Times recommended that Philadelphia should be a top 3 destination in the world after Milan and Cuba. And Cuba's a whole country, based entirely on the quality of the city's revitalized parks and public spaces. But I'm quick to point out that those improvements were decades in the making, starting with reinvigorating our tired historic district, transforming it from the day trip on a school bus to see the Liberty Bell to become the heart of a thriving heritage tourism industry. We turned barren and desolate Dilworth Park, the city's civic center, into a new, highly diverse people place. Like Cleveland, we created new public access to our formerly industrial riverfronts on the Schuylkill River and on the Delaware riverfront. And some of the improvements weren't even all that capital intensive. For example, we turned sidewalks and parking lots into new public spaces with pop-up improvements and programming. But the net effect of all that highly visible investment was a dramatic improvement in the public image of the city. And these improvements delivered exactly the kind of tangible amenities new residents moving to Center City wanted. But these improvements also have the strong effect of highlighting the enormous investment disparity in the rest of the city. Decades of investment targeted to downtown has been paralleled by significant disinvestment in the neighborhoods outside of Center City. The extent to which the quality of community facilities were neglected and allowed to decline over decades is nothing short of scandalous. But running on a campaign focused on increasing equity, Mayor Kenny's platform championed making similar investments in neighborhood parks, public spaces, and amenities so that all residents of the city could have access to high-quality amenities. So with the election of Jim Kenney in November of 2015, a policy goal of equitable community reinvestment was set. I want to touch briefly on our own role as the city's largest private funder in helping to stimulate a focus on enhancing neighborhood and community assets. The William Penn Foundation, along with others, notably Pew, were major contributors to the enhancement of Center City public spaces. In the decade just between 2001 and 2011, William Penn alone invested $25 million in downtown parks and public spaces. In 2012, when the foundation began a new strategic planning process, our board expressed a strong desire to build on and expand upon those investments. Our board wanted the foundation to start focusing on and expanding access to high-quality amenities in that next tier of neighborhoods around Center City. Through our own internal planning process, we identified 17 priority landscapes in that targeted second tier of neighborhoods, and currently we're about halfway through those planned investments. But the result of all that planning was our Great Public Spaces grant-making program, which was officially launched in 2013. The program makes about $16 million a year in grants to increase access to high-quality public spaces and amenities, especially in low-income communities. But the thing to note about it is that while the program is targeted to neighborhoods outside of downtown, it's only an incremental step. The program does not yet reach or embrace the entire city. To do that, we needed a bigger strategy and a bigger frame, which is where Rebuild comes in. The last piece of the puzzle I want to talk about is the people part and talk about the public leadership team that has made Rebuild possible. While our mayor, Jim Kenney, was well known from his many years on city council, I think many people were surprised, frankly, by the boldness of his early agenda, which had a big emphasis on expanding equity. I've seen him get very upset, emotional, angry when he talks about the difference in the quality between the parks and recreation facilities that children in the city have access to compared to kids in the burbs. I think he clearly feels that's unfair, but I think he also fully understands that these are the kind of issues that drive families and people out of cities. But one of his key decisions was to elevate Michael DeBerardinis, the Park and Rec Commissioner, to become managing director of the city. Mike is the architect of Rebuild. He's a well-regarded, highly skilled, and passionate public servant with a long career in parks and recreation, a mentor to me. But he's never forgotten his roots as a community organizer, which is why when he developed the concept, Mike never saw it as a capital program. For him, it was only a platform for community engagement and empowerment. Another key member of Jim Kenny's administration is Catherine Ott Lovell, who now heads the city's Park and Rec Department. A truly gifted leader, Catherine is working to build a new culture within the Parks and Recreation Department, focused on enhancing service while strengthening partnerships with local parks, friends groups, and recreation center advisory councils. For Rebuild to succeed over the long term, we will need those friends groups and recreation advisory councils to feel fully engaged. They have to have a very strong sense of ownership over the process and the results for it to succeed. Rounding out the city's strong leadership team is our amazing head librarian, Siobhan Reardon. Siobhan is a visionary who we stole from New York, who's long appreciated that libraries had to change to respond to the new roles and demands that are being placed on them. And several years ago, she launched the 21st Century Library Initiative, which is intended to formally redesign the 54 branches of the library system to serve local community needs. Each library will have a specific community service mission. And in this way, the 21st Century Library Initiative really presaged Rebuild and has served as a model for us for community development and community-informed local infrastructure investment. All right, enough preamble. Now that I've shared the conditions that made Rebuild possible, I want to take into the program design itself. Mayor Kinney's commitment to equity is embedded in the vision of Rebuild. It's about ensuring that every resident has access to high-quality amenities. Promoting sustainability and economic opportunity are also central to the vision. And we had hoped from the start, modestly, that it could be a new model of community investment that others could possibly learn from. There are three elements to Rebuild. Number one is capital improvement to existing facilities, but primarily as platforms for better programming. Secondly, the program also has very ambitious goals for workforce diversity and inclusion, including creating supports to grow minority-owned businesses. And finally, as I've said before, another central aim of the initiative is to reinvigorate civic life in the city through extensive community engagement. The whole program is organized around just two goals: advancing equity, which is where the bulk of Rebuild resources will be directed, and secondly, leveraging the investments of others, meaning taking advantage of and building on the investments that others are already making to help drive community economic development. But for us, what really differentiated Rebuild and attracted our attention and interest is that the initiative is really about a change in the city's business practices that is shifting from a primary political allocation of resources to a more of a strategic, data-driven decision-making process that directs the maximum resources to the greatest need. In determining that need, the city looked beyond just existing facilities conditions and developed data sets that created comprehensive portraits of the local context for every park, rec center, and library in the city. Data on poverty rates, drug offenses, health risks, and others were taken into account in helping to shape recommendations for investments that would advance equity in the city. Similarly, data was gathered that might shed light on where funding might leverage investment by others. So based on existing facility conditions, local community conditions, and the input from elected officials, stakeholders, and local community members, the city ranked every park, rec, and library facility in terms of its ability to advance equity or its ability to advance economic development. As I mentioned earlier, in Philadelphia, historically, capital investment in community infrastructure has been allocated politically, meaning that every district council person gets the same amount of funding. As a consequence, the current capital allocation system actually reinforces inequality. Since every district gets the same amount, districts with many older facilities, such as North Philadelphia, never catch up, while districts with fewer newer facilities continue to improve. So the traditional political allocation of resources, while on its face seems fair with everybody getting the same amount, actually only serve to reinforce inequality in many of the city's neighborhoods. So in the first program year of Rebuild program identified 60 initial investments. Now under the old system, every one of the 10 council member districts would have gotten 6 projects. However, under Rebuild, District 5 in North Philadelphia, which has one of the highest concentrations of poverty in the city, is slated to have 9 projects, while the relatively more prosperous second district will only receive 2. Now, while to the good people of Cleveland, this might seem obvious and not particularly earth-shattering, for Philadelphia, this represents the equivalent of a seismic shift in community reinvestment practices. And how was this seismic shift possible? Well, the credit really goes to the political instincts of the mayor and his team. Programmatically, while some got more than others, nobody was left out. The data became very important, and the media coverage that carried it also told a very compelling story, and it was very hard to argue against the desire to focus on areas of great need as revealed by the data. And the grassroots advocacy effort was also very strong, and City Council, for good or bad, is still responsive to community pressure, especially in front of the TV cameras. Speaking of which, as I mentioned, civic engagement is one of the 3 key pillars of Rebuild. At one level, this means what most people think of as civic engagement, involving local community in the planning and decision-making of particular projects or community improvements to promote a sense of ownership and stewardship. At a higher level, ultimately, it's about revitalizing the city's entire neighborhood of civic infrastructure. It's block captains, it's recreation advisory council, it's park and recreation friends groups. And those engagement activities are planned to occur at both the project level and citywide through a new public body called the Rebuild Oversight Board, a 19-member group of public and private civic leaders. As its name suggests, the Oversight Board is intended to provide public oversight and accountability for the program, and they meet quarterly in different neighborhoods throughout the city to provide a public forum for the initiative. The third and perhaps most challenging pillar of Rebuild is workforce inclusion and supports for minority business development. These are extremely important goals for the program, given Philadelphia's very high poverty rate. The actual numeric goals set by City Council for participation of minority workers and businesses are quite ambitious. 30% for minority business participation, 45% for minority employee inclusion. So high expectations is a big challenge. And while $500 million sounds like a lot, and it is, Rebuild won't create thousands of new jobs. But it can be a pathway for many, especially for folks who are marginally attached to the workforce, to obtain both skills and work history that can help lead toward more stable employment elsewhere. One of the keys to the success of Rebuild meeting its inclusion targets, however, will be new planned supports for emerging minority businesses that are already more likely to hire low-skilled workers, thereby having an important dual effect. Now, the aim of the business supports program is to help grow small businesses so that they can take on larger and more complex projects over the long life of Rebuild, which is expected to take 8 years. Turning toward program delivery, the implementation structure of Rebuild is somewhat complicated. In an effort to promote maximum local community involvement, implementation of Rebuild will rely on what I would characterize as a decentralized delivery system. Local nonprofits called project users that were previously vetted will bid for funding through the Rebuild program to implement specific projects on an annual project list. And we can talk about that more in a moment. Finally, I want to touch on where the money is coming from. Of the $500 million program budget, the bulk of it will be from public sources, including $300 million in new bonds that will be financed through the city's new Sugary Beverage Tax, which I'll talk about in a moment. An additional $48 million comes from the city's regular capital budget, and adding in our $100 million leaves a funding gap of about $52 million, which is expected to come from other public and private sources. Talking about costs is a good segue to talk about how we're going to pay for it. As I mentioned, a major source of program finance is the new Sugary Beverage Tax passed by City Council in the summer of 2016, making Philadelphia the first big city in the U.S. to pass such a tax. This is a tax that failed twice before in Philadelphia, but Mayor Kenny adopted a different and some would say more politically pragmatic approach. The proceeds from prior beverage tax proposals were directed to the city's general fund, meaning that no one reaped any kind of political benefit from them. But Mayor Kenny tied his proposal to 3 popular efforts: Rebuild, expanded pre-K, and community schools, meaning that every council person eventually would get something. As a consequence, the legislation passed City Council by a majority of 13-4. Rebuild, universal pre-K, and community schools were strategic choices in that each was also associated with a strong pre-existing advocacy effort. Advocacy efforts that could be activated and mobilized in support of the initiative, which would be necessary even after City Council approved the legislation. Because not surprisingly, the national beverage industry mounted a strong opposition campaign to the Sugary Beverage Tax, obviously recognizing that this would be a huge precedent nationally. The beverage industry spent $11 million just fighting the bill in Philadelphia City Council. We have no idea how much they spent in subsequent lawsuits, which they fought all the way to the state Supreme Court, where ultimately it was upheld. But having failed in the courts, the beverage industry is now trying to invalidate the tax through new legislation, as is done in California. But if it makes it to the governor's desk, we're hopeful that Governor Wolf will veto it. City Council's involvement with Rebuild, however, did not end with the passage of the beverage tax. And I think it's just worth taking a moment to note some of the peculiarities of Philadelphia City Council, which might present a challenge to Rebuild. Since we're all friends here, I will share, since I'm in Ohio, I'm not at home, my personal nickname for Philadelphia is Councilvania, the city of 10 mayors. I'm not sure that Game of Thrones is the right metaphor for maybe it's Game of 10 Thrones, but because of the long-standing informal practice of what we call councilmanic prerogative, which means that nothing can happen in a council district without that council member's approval, more strategic and citywide initiatives are very difficult to achieve in Philadelphia. And despite a strong mayor form of government, there's a continuing tension between the mayor and city council over the ultimate control of Rebuild, which could present a challenge going forward, which is why the involvement of private partners and funders is so important. So it's not just that public funding is at risk. Speaking of private supporters, I want to conclude by talking a little bit about philanthropic efforts in support of Rebuild. Our regional funder affinity group, the Philanthropy Network of Greater Philadelphia, has started a Rebuild Funders Group. The Rebuild Funders Group meets regularly to provide a forum where the entire 140 members of the network can learn about Rebuild. And while we're supporting the effort by helping to staff it and through our own major grant, we're trying to take a back seat and create more leadership opportunities for other funders, particularly smaller foundations, to become involved. Because while the additional financial support is really important, what we really want are more influential voices and more eyes on the effort to help maintain the integrity of the program. The Funders Group has created a menu of investment opportunities for funders of varying sizes and interests, so they can all see themselves in the initiative. And there are some additional incentives that have been developed. Our grant, our $100 million grant, includes $22 million matching fund, providing 50% match for all other public and private gifts. We're also funding all the administrative costs for the pooled fund. And all private investment will be subject to third-party financial oversight, a further reassurance to the private funding community. So all sounds great, doesn't it? Nothing could possibly go wrong, right? I tell people there's 500 million ways this could go wrong. But Rebuild is now officially underway. Community engagement, planning, and design for the first project has already started. But given the novelty and scale of the initiative, I think both the Rebuild team and we as a major partner are alert to and aware of the challenges ahead. And there are certainly a lot of ways the initiative could go off the rails or fail to meet its high expectations. But we do feel strongly that the commitment to transparency, civic engagement, and strong partnerships will help mitigate those risks. So I'm going to wrap up by turning back to that earlier theme of city-to-city exchange. And I'll close by sharing a quote from one of our local Philadelphia experts on urban resilience. Yes, Mr. Rocky Balboa, who famously said, "It's not how hard you hit, it's how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward." That's urban resilience, Philly style. Well, and in Philadelphia, our community infrastructure has taken a lot of hits over the years. But now as a city, we are determined to work together and move forward to rebuild those assets in a fair and equitable way, using our own resources and the tremendous untapped power of our local communities. Thank you for allowing me to share our work, and I look forward to talking more about it with you. Thank you.
Good job. I'm Dan Multhrop, Chief Executive here at the City Club. Today we're enjoying a forum with Shawn McCaney, Executive Director of the William Penn Foundation. Are you familiar with the corollary to Balboa's quote from Mike Tyson? Everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth, right? Okay. We're about to begin the audience Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, those of you joining us via our live webcast. If you'd like to tweet a question, a quick reminder, you can tweet it at the City Club, and our staff will work it into the program. Holding our microphones today are Content Coordinator Bliss Davis and Membership and Customer Service Manager Corey Isler. May we have our first question, please?
Welcome to Cleveland. I grew up in Philadelphia, And
We want you back.
Thank you. I talk fast too, but I think without the accent. I'm going to get myself in trouble with people in this group. Dana Rusikoff, who spoke here at the City Club, I think 2 years ago, wrote a book called The Prize, which had to do with Michael Zuckerberg's pledge of $100 million to improve the New York school system. And basically the book painted as a fiasco, and the thesis of the book is that there wasn't a lot of community involvement to have all of these changes. And in listening to your presentation, I get the impression it is very much a top-down approach. What is being done to involve members of the community, and at what level, to make sure this is a success?
It's a great question. And while it may seem as top-down, it's really both top-down and bottom-up. The fundamental planning for Rebuild was very community-driven and really rested on a lot of community involvement. And there is a commitment to have deep community engagement with each project. So each project that will be developed for Rebuild is a new engagement opportunity for the city. The data that I showed was really sort of like high level. There's no design, there's no planning done. Every facility will be developed with community engagement within the context of their own neighborhood. And as I said, one of the things we insisted on as a funder, that there had to be some kind of public oversight, a place, a forum where citizens outside of not just city council, but a place where people could come and talk and ask questions and interrogate the leadership of Rebuild. And that's why the Oversight Board was created. So we're incredibly committed to community involvement. As I said, Mike DeBerardinis, who is leading the effort, he doesn't even think of this as a capital program. It's really about reactivating the civic infrastructure of the city, using these kind of investments as a platform and a place to do that.
Could you please talk about the immigrant community of Philadelphia and how these plans will affect them?
So we are defiantly a sanctuary city. We have survived some court challenges around that. One of the engines of revitalization of Philadelphia has been a doubling of foreign-born residents in the city. Philadelphia for a long time was a very parochial city, but starting in the late 90s and into the early 2000s, the immigrant population of Philadelphia really resurged, and it's become an important part of the city's overall renaissance. The work of Rebuild is really modeled on several smaller initiatives that were already underway prior to Mayor McCaney coming into the office. One of them I already mentioned, which was the 21st Century Library Initiative. We really learned how to do this work by doing half a dozen libraries and using community-driven design principles to renovate those libraries. But there were others. And one of the most important planning processes that we're looking at now is one that's led by the Southeast Asian Mutual Aid Society in South Philadelphia. South Philadelphia is home to a large refugee community. And so we're using that as a model to sort of understand how to engage communities that are not English language speaking or foreign born. And that will help inform the larger effort of our work with immigrant communities in Philadelphia. But it's a big issue for Philadelphia because on the one hand, immigration is driving change in the city, but also we don't feel like their voices have been sufficiently heard in the city's leadership, by the city's leadership.
Please say more about the workforce inclusion, community initiatives there, and also about the building trades.
Yeah, so I mentioned that the workforce inclusion goals are ambitious, and that's because we have a lousy track record of Philadelphia of diversifying the workforce, and the building trades is a huge obstacle to that. And City Council really took leadership on it and insisted on those high goals because of the bad past experience of the city. So we are modeling the workforce diversity program on an existing program developed by the University of Pennsylvania, which has proved to be very successful in engaging local neighborhood residents in local workforce. So we're not starting from scratch. We are modeling it on an existing program. The mayor himself just launched a new workforce strategy earlier this year, which emphasizes workforce inclusion, especially for folks who are marginally attached to the workforce. The other part of the equation, though, is the small minority-owned business supports, and we're focused on that because we think those are the places where, those are the kind of companies that actually will hire local people to work in their companies. But, for many reasons, they struggle. Lack of access to capital, limited back office operations, a whole reason why those companies can't grow and move up the scale of operation. So as part of Rebuild, what we're doing is we're creating a fund that can be used to capitalize small businesses, but also we're developing or retaining a series of businesses as mentors. These are companies that won't compete for Rebuild projects, but they'll provide the training, mentoring of smaller companies to help train them up to take on bigger projects. It's the hardest part of the thing. I'll be the first to admit this is going to be a challenge for the program to succeed. But I feel like we're taking it seriously, and we're trying to address every possible obstacle to making it succeed.
Hi, welcome to Cleveland.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about your plans for long-term stewardship of these spaces, operations, programming, maintenance, that sort of thing?
That's a great question. Gosh, I guess we have to maintain these, right? And I'm sorry I didn't talk about that a little bit more, because it really is central to the whole program. I mean, fundamentally, Rebuild is a maintenance program. It is deferred maintenance, although we're hoping to get a lot more out of it by transforming these facilities. But a couple of things have happened that have been built into the program. The first is when Mike DeBerardinis was the Park and Rec Commissioner, he did a great thing, which was he significantly expanded the skilled trades within the Parks and Rec department. There's now 60 folks in that department who have the ability to maintain, operate, and repair facilities up to a certain dollar amount. So the Parks and Rec department and the library department, which are under the same deputy mayor, are much more capable now of managing and maintaining the system than it has been in probably a generation. The second component of the maintenance discussion is that we are very focused on building durable facilities, building facilities that really through sustainable design principles will be much more durable, much more energy efficient, and easier to maintain over the long term. I know it's not very glamorous, but you cannot believe how much time we spend thinking about what's the right bathroom partition, right, for that we can use across the system instead of having 50 different versions. So really the design process is intended to reduce maintenance costs and make it easier to manage and maintain those facilities. I think the most important part, though, is the community stewardship, because it's only because of organizing over the last couple of years that the Parks and Rec department has had more resources. I mean, this is a department, and I'm sure it's true in every city, that as the city declined, things were just, things were taken out of it, its budget was cut. It was always easy to cut the Parks department. But for the first time in 30 years, Parks budget has been increased. But the only way that continues is if those parks groups, those recreation advisory councils are still out on the street demanding of city council more and continued investment in the system. And I fully believe that if they're not bought in, Rebuild on the ground, they won't be there on the other end when we need them to advocate for more funding.
Good afternoon. Thanks for the great talk, and saw a lot of head nodding, so I appreciate that. Question about some connectivity with your Commissioner of Health, who's a bit of a rock star, and you mentioned your Parks and Recreation Commissioner and how important his role is. But I saw in one of the assessors for the neighborhood facilities a health assessment.
Yes.
And so if zip codes determining is more than your genetic code for life outcomes,
Right.
how are we building in the social determinants and measuring, and is your commissioner involved in that?
Yeah, so the health risks were one of the things we looked at. It's interesting because in prior planning efforts, we never looked at these things together. We looked at things like facility conditions, or somebody did a study on transportation, but it was the first time, in fact, I should mention, this is the first time the city's ever mapped all of its facilities. There's 400 of them. They never had a map. There was no map that showed everything. And so we layered on top of that all these other conditions like health and other risks. The health commissioner has been involved. The director of sustainability has been involved. The effort that we're now funding is a big evaluation program, and as the legislation, the beverage tax, and the bonding all seems to be in place. Now we're focusing on developing an evaluation regime for the program, which will look at all those metrics. There are 1,000 things we could look at. So we are funding an effort to have an evaluator just to assess to us what we should be looking at. What are the key metrics that should measure the success of rebuild? And over the years, we'll collect data on those, and we'll be able to look back and see what kind of impact we had, both community level as well as project level.
We have a question from Facebook. Cleveland has a great lake, and Philly has some great riverfronts. How does the city plan to help people in neighborhoods that aren't on the river enjoy these river assets?
That's a great question. That's something I think a lot about. I should mention, and I'm sorry, I'm trained as a planner, and I came out of the public space and parks area. The city has been developing a number of ways to increase accessibility, and accessibility is not only, is there a way to get to a public space, but is there programming that communities are interested in. One of the things that we are proud to talk about is we have the nation's first accessible bike share program. Bike share is usually confined to like the downtown and tourist areas of cities. We help fund a program to create bike share in every neighborhood of the city with the intention of creating linkages between communities and parks. That was why we did it. We wanted to create recreation linkages between neighborhoods and community assets, including the riverfront, both riverfronts. We're also looking at supporting a new trail system or expanding the trail system. And as our riverfront trail systems have evolved, they're not finished, right? I mean, there's a lot of work that's been done, but they're not finished. We'll then begin to think about how we move perpendicularly. We're already thinking about, is there a need for a cross-city greenway that would link both rivers and all the neighborhoods in between, for example, like in North Philadelphia. So it's very much on our mind. We think a lot about it. And we won't be able to provide access to many neighborhoods, to public space in their neighborhoods, but we can provide excellent access to places where that public space exists. That's our aim.
I want to invite you to tell more of the story about the Sugary Beverage Tax, and specifically how you got stakeholders with varied interests to agree to share a stream of revenue, which I think is sort of fascinating. But please tell more of the story. Fill in the blanks.
I'm not sure there's a whole lot more to share, except to say that it's the Sugary Beverage Tax. I'll be the first to say is not ideal. Right, this is not a great way to fund public assets. And I was saying to someone earlier, I think, I'm involved in a lot of conversations about equity. Equity ain't free, right? I mean, people talk a lot about the delivery of equity. They talk a lot about the services we're going to provide, but I hear very few conversations about where's the money coming from. And we have to get to a place where we understand that equity is probably parallel with growth, that there has to be new investment in the city to help support equity. But in that context of very constrained dollars, I think there was just an understanding of the folks from the parks advocacy groups and the folks who are interested in things like universal pre-K, that this was the chance. That if we didn't work together, if we didn't combine resources to fight for this tax, and it was not a foregone conclusion. One of the biggest philanthropists in the city owns a beverage company. And, so there were city council people who were, I don't care how many goodies you throw at me, I have serious, issues with this. But, the grassroots effort that was orchestrated, I think was terrific. It was effective. And, the question for me, as I mentioned earlier, will be how do you keep that advocacy together over the long life of this program and even beyond? Sorry if that wasn't more sexy, but...
No, it's not.
Hi, I'm Kyle Dreyfus-Wells. I run the sewer district here in Cleveland, and welcome to town.
We love sewers.
We love sewers more.
No. I want to talk to you about combined sewer overflow. It really gets me going.
Wait a minute, let me just pause. This is great, prelude to the question. So in our water world, Philly is known for leadership on stormwater management, green infrastructure for combined sewer overflow control. So how does that fit into the rebuild?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that there were projects and efforts like the library initiative that help really inspire or model rebuild. One which was long in coming but ultimately very successful was with the Trust for Public Lands, Parks for People program in Philadelphia, which is in the process of converting 20 or so asphalt-covered schoolyards into new green spaces for communities. It's a very exciting program, and it's only, and you know, the school district is one of the biggest landowners in the city, so it's a very important opportunity for new open space. But through that program, we're able to get the school district, the city, Parks and Rec, and the water department, which handles our sewer system, to work together. We spent a year hammering, well, not a year, but almost a year hammering out an agreement that served as a model for those agencies and organizations to work together. So we have that template. People now understand how to work together and what the benefits are. The water department, I should mention that there's a rebuild team, right? There's a staff that runs rebuild, but there's interagency organization that sort of sits on top of it. It's like, I think 60 people participate in regular meetings within the city staff. And of course, the water department is a member of that. So we're very much, you know, hoping to not only include the practices of the water department, but use their funding, right? They are a source of funding for new green infrastructure and public space.
You mentioned that an equal allocation of council funds is not necessarily an equitable allocation. How did you work through that process, not just with the council people, but with their residents? Because here, very much like Philadelphia, the sense is that funds are used within an area, and trying to get people to see the bigger picture is difficult.
Yeah, I will say it certainly wasn't easy. The big challenge was that changing that approach really threatened councilmanic power. It was a huge challenge. But, again, on the one hand, no one was left out. Everyone got something. So it wasn't like an all or nothing event. The other thing too is, and I can't emphasize this enough, there was a media campaign, there was data. It was hard to sort of ignore the data, ignore the reality that North Philadelphia has lots of horrible rec centers. They're beloved, but they're horrible. And so I think that the being driven by data, a strong media campaign, made it easier for people to sort of say, okay, I recognize you're going to get more than I am. I remember the second district council member, he came into the program, I believe he supported it, but he didn't expect to get anything just because of the story of rebuild. He in the end did, everyone got something. But I would say I'll also be honest, I think it's a fragile truce. I think it'll be hard to replicate. We did it once, maybe we can. But it's 3 years of planning and advocacy to get to this point. So stay tuned. We'll see if it really works.
Hi. So you mentioned how one of the challenges in this would be the changing of city leadership or just leadership in general. And I was wondering if you could elaborate how the rebuild effort is structured as a way to mitigate that challenge, but also to not prevent kind of different stakeholders and different checks and balances in inhibiting the progress of the program.
It's a great question. Yeah, it's an 8-year program because the mayor assumes he's getting elected again, which, well, there's a good likelihood. So I want to point to another model that helped, again, to inform the development rebuild, which was our Delaware River Waterfront Initiative. We started that initiative back in 2007 and funded a citizen-driven planning process that involved 4,000 people, 150 meetings, to come up with a new master plan for the riverfront that oriented around public access. The riverfront was being developed like hither and yon without any kind of plan or structure, and public access wasn't a part of the scheme. And the city wasn't providing leadership. This is 2 mayors ago. And what was really interesting about that process, and it really informed our thinking here, is that we didn't do a plan initially. We did like a visioning process that developed principles, right? Ideas about what should happen on that riverfront. And the community groups that helped shape that vision really owned it. And 10 years later, those groups still meet. They are still together as a powerful advocacy effort along the riverfront. They own the vision, and then the managerial group that was created for the waterfront created the plan. And there's sort of a tension between the two. And that advocacy group, the Central Delaware Advocacy Group, constantly holds the management group's feet to the fire with the vision. Right? They're saying, this is what we agreed to years ago. So I hate to keep coming back to the same explanation, but if there isn't public support, strong public support, these things don't survive. Now, the waterfront planning process began in the administration of Mayor Street, toward the end of it. And I went in to Mayor Nutter's office to meet with him and tell him about all this wonderful work we were doing. I remember he was eating a hoagie, and he'd just been elected. He seemed kind of like cool and uninterested. And so I thought, oh, we're screwed. I mean, this guy doesn't want to keep the plan going. But on the evening of the release of the master plan, 1,500 people showed up at the convention center. And Michael Nutter came in the back of the room, looked around, and went right to the front of the room and said, this is my plan too. So I there's no other way to get around it. I mean, you have to have strong political and public advocacy for these efforts if they're going to survive. And the Delaware River Waterfront Initiative is now on its third mayor, primarily because of the community involvement and public advocacy that's gone on before many years there.
We'll take a question from Twitter next. What have critics said about Rebuild Philadelphia?
I think the big challenge, I think, was raising people's expectations. I think that was a mistake, frankly. And, it's hard not to do that. The mayor was very excited about it and, talked a lot about it in his campaign. And when he became mayor, it was a centerpiece of his first budget. The reality is there's 400 facilities. This program can maybe get to 150, 200, maybe. So every oversight board meeting, people come to the meeting and say, where's my facility, right? I mean, people really want their facilities improved. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to all of them through this first round of rebuild, even if there's a subsequent round. So we should have managed expectations much better. We really should have been clear up front about what could be achieved, what could be expected. And I think we would have avoided some of the risks that come along with that.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. Obviously, this is a very strong city program. I'm wondering, is there regional participation, regional buy-in to this program? Right, as we always talk about in Cleveland, what happens in the city of Cleveland affects the surrounding suburbs and region. I'm wondering if there's that aspect.
We see that too, and the suburbs don't care. No, it's a challenge. There's 250 municipalities in our region, and we have not had a strong history of regionalism in Philadelphia. I'll just be upfront about it. There's no regional infrastructure. There are no regional governing bodies. There are no regional institutions except for our transit system, which is primarily Philadelphia focused. And that's made it very hard to sort of engage the suburban communities. Mayors have tried, and certainly it is true. The way Philadelphia is painted paints the whole region. There's no doubt about it. But it's still not been enough to bring, to stimulate really a big commitment to regionalism. Now, the hope is that those communities are changing. A lot of the neighborhoods and communities outside of Philadelphia are starting to look a lot more like Philadelphia. Delaware County, which is the county directly to the west, elected Democratic council people for the first time ever. Montgomery County, the richest county in Pennsylvania probably, has a Democratic-led council. So there's the potential for change. And we're starting to see small efforts at city-suburb collaboration. But I'm afraid that's going to be an incremental effort. And it's not going to happen right away. But I'm hopeful. Well,
Great job, man. Thank you so much. Yeah. Today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a forum with Shawn D. McCaney, Executive Director of the William Penn Foundation. Our community partners for our program today are Cleveland Neighborhood Progress and the Western Reserve Land Conservancy. We appreciate your partnership in promoting our forum today. Also, we welcome guests at tables hosted by the Cleveland Foundation, the Knight Foundation, Land Studio, and the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. That brings us to the end of our forum. Thank you, Mr. McCaney. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending. Our forum is adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland Incorporated.